The North Sea was not just cold, it was lethal. When Viking crews pushed their longships into winter waters, the icy wind cut through wool, skin, and bone. Even the toughest warrior could freeze before reaching land. People often imagine Vikings as invincible giants who simply endured the cold. But the truth is more fascinating. They had a secret, a forgotten technique that allowed them to survive conditions that should have killed them in hours. It wasn't magic. It was a clever blend of biology, materials, and pure northern ingenuity. Before long voyages, Vikings prepared themselves differently than nearly any other civilization of their time. They built their layers strategically, not just with wool and fur, but with a surprising element almost no one today talks about. And it began with their understanding of how the human body traps heat. Most people today assume they used only fur to stay warm, but fur alone is useless when soaked, and the sea soaked everything. So the Vikings used a trick so counterintuitive that modern survival experts still talk about it. They wore a layer of animal skin with the fat still attached. To the Vikings, this wasn't disgusting, it was genius. Fat insulates far better than dry cloth, and even when wet, it retains heat trapped close to the body. When you combine that with wool underneath and fur on top, you create an early form of survival-level thermal engineering. What makes this even more impressive is that they didn't discover it by accident. It was the result of generations of trial, error, and struggle against an enemy harsher than any kingdom they raided, the northern winter itself. Their ancestors in Norway used fat-lined hides while hunting in snow, and the technique evolved into maritime survival. Viking sailors treated warmth as a form of armor. Just like they sharpened axes before a raid, they prepared their winter gear with the same seriousness, because one mistake at sea could mean never returning home. That's why the forgotten fat layer trick became a quiet but essential part of their survival culture. But there was one more twist, something even modern historians often overlook. Vikings didn't just rely on clothing, they used a heat-trapping method inside the longship itself, turning their longship into a primitive thermal shelter during the coldest nights. This method is almost never mentioned in documentaries, but it was their true secret weapon. For most people, a wooden ship in icy seas sounds like a death trap. For the Vikings, it became a moving shelter, carefully engineered to trap heat and block the wind. Their survival depended not on comfort, but on control. The key was how Vikings used space. They slept low, close to the hull, where cold air moved less and body heat accumulated. Standing upright meant losing warmth, so they stayed crouched, packed together like living insulation. Modern ships are designed for airflow. Viking ships were designed to fight it. Shields weren't just for battle. They were hung along the ship's sides to block freezing wind and trap heat inside the hull. But the most surprising detail wasn't the shields. It was how Vikings used shared warmth deliberately and strategically. Sleeping shoulder to shoulder wasn't a matter of comfort, it was survival mathematics. To maintain heat through the night, Vikings used ember pots, small containers holding glowing coals from the hearth. These weren't open fires, but carefully managed heat sources that radiated warmth without igniting the ship. A single mistake could burn the vessel, but without them, men could freeze to death before dawn. They also timed rest in shifts. Some men slept while others rowed, keeping blood moving and muscles warm. Constant motion helped prevent hypothermia. Even exhaustion was safer than stillness. Salt water soaked everything, but Vikings avoided removing wet clothing completely because exposed skin lost heat too fast. Instead, they relied on layered, fat-lined hides that retained warmth even when damp. What made this system work was discipline. Every man knew his place, his role, and the rhythm of the ship. Warmth wasn't accidental, it was planned, enforced, and shared. By dawn, the ship felt less like a coffin and more like a living organism, breathing, warming, surviving. Other sailors froze or panicked. Vikings adapted. For Vikings, food was more than fuel. It was insulation. On freezing seas, what you ate could mean the difference between surviving the night or never seeing land again. Modern sailors avoid heavy meals in extreme cold. Vikings did the opposite. They understood, through hard experience, that digesting fat generates heat long after the food is eaten. One of their most important foods was bone marrow. Easy to store, extremely dense in calories, and rich in fat, it burned slowly inside the body like a hidden hearth. A few spoonfuls could keep a man warm for hours. They also consumed rendered animal fat, sometimes mixed directly into dried meat or eaten on its own. To modernize, it looks unpleasant. To Vikings, it was survival perfection. Before sleeping, crews often ate deliberately heavy meals. The goal wasn't comfort, it was metabolic heat. As their bodies worked through dense fats, warmth radiated outward, helping them survive the coldest hours of the night. Vikings also drank warm broths made from meat scraps, bones, and fat. The liquid heat warmed the core immediately, while the fat sustained warmth long after. This combination was especially vital during storms, when exposure was constant. Salt played a role too. Salted meat encouraged thirst, forcing sailors to drink more warm liquids. Hydration kept blood flowing, and flowing blood meant warmth. Their diet wasn't random, it was optimized by generations of trial, failure, and death. Every bite was calculated, not for taste, but for heat, endurance, and survival. This is why Vikings could remain functional when others collapsed. They weren't just dressed for the cold, they were burning from the inside. Food became fire. But even heat from food had limits. When storms lasted for days, Vikings relied on something even more primal, a sweeping method that turned exhaustion into insulation. For a Viking at sea, sleep was the most dangerous moment of the day. Muscles relaxed, movement stopped, and in freezing wind, stillness could kill faster than any blade. The Vikings understood something most sailors didn't. You don't fight the cold while sleeping, you contain yourself from it. Their sleeping method turned the human body into a sealed heat source. They slept fully clothed, not loosely wrapped, but compressed. Belts, straps, and cloaks were tightened deliberately to eliminate air gaps where cold could circulate. Then came the most important rule: no space between bodies. Vikings slept packed tightly together, shoulder to shoulder, leg to leg. This wasn't comfort, it was a survival grid where each body reinforced the heat of the others. They positioned themselves low in the ship, near the hull. Cold air sinks, but it also moves faster above deck. By sleeping low and shielded, they avoided wind exposure entirely. Blankets were layered in a specific order: wool closest to the body, fat-lined hide in the middle, fur on the outside, acting as a barrier against wind and moisture. Even their heads were protected. Hoods were pulled tight, beards tucked in, faces partially covered to reduce exposed skin. Only the nose and eyes remained free, just enough to breathe. They avoided changing clothes at night. Wet garments were uncomfortable, but removing them meant instant heat loss. Instead, body heat slowly dried the inner layers while fat-lined hides prevented cold from seeping back in. Silence was enforced. Movement was minimized. Every shift risked breaking the thermal seal they had created around themselves. By morning, frost covered the outside of their blankets. But beneath those frozen layers, the men were alive, warm enough to rise, row, and fight again. The cold had been held at bay, not defeated, but delayed just long enough. This sleeping method wasn't written down. It was learned by watching others survive and remembering those who didn't. A quiet knowledge passed from voyage to voyage. But even this wasn't the final layer of protection. When cold pushed beyond clothing, food, and sleep, Vikings relied on something deeper: ritual, movement, and discipline of the mind. Cold doesn't just attack the body, it attacks the mind. The Vikings understood that freezing often began with hesitation, not weakness. They believed stillness was dangerous, not panic, but stagnation. So they developed a strict routine of controlled movement designed to keep blood flowing without exhausting the body. Rowing wasn't just transportation, it was heat generation. Short, steady strokes kept muscles active, pumping warmth through the limbs while conserving energy. When storms prevented rowing, Vikings rotated duties. No one stayed idle for too long. Standing watch, adjusting rigging, checking shields, every task was movement with purpose. They avoided sudden bursts of effort. Sweat was dangerous. Moisture meant rapid heat loss, so movements were slow, deliberate, and controlled. Even breathing was controlled. Deep, steady breaths through the nose helped warm the air before it reached the lungs. Sharp gasps were discouraged, a sign of panic, not strength. They also relied on rhythm, chanting quietly or counting strokes. Sound helped maintain focus and synchronize movement, preventing mental fatigue. In the cold, losing focus could be fatal. The body followed the mind. A man who panicked wasted heat. A man who stayed disciplined survived. These routines weren't taught through words, they were enforced through example and through loss. Every crew carried the memory of someone who froze because they broke the rhythm. By maintaining movement, Vikings delayed exhaustion, preserved warmth, and stayed alive long enough to reach land. Cold didn't defeat them, it tested them. Yet even discipline had limits. When storms stretched into days, Vikings relied on something more ancient than technique: belief. When the cold lasted too long, muscles failed. Food ran low. Sleep became shallow and broken. At that point, survival was no longer just physical. It was spiritual. Vikings believed the cold was not random. It was a trial sent by the gods, especially Odin, who tested warriors through suffering. Enduring the cold wasn't just survival, it was proof of worth. They spoke of warriors who froze and lived, of men who endured nights so cold that time itself seemed to stop. These stories weren't meant to terrify, they were meant to prepare. Before sleep, some whispered prayers. Others carved small runes into wood or bone, symbols of protection, warmth, and endurance. These acts didn't change the temperature, but they changed the mind. Fear wasted energy. Belief focused it. A man who believed the gods watched him stayed calmer, steadier, warmer. Even their rituals were practical. Short chants synchronized breathing. Rhythmic motions kept circulation steady. Faith and function merged into one. They believed dying of cold without fear was honorable, not because they wanted death, but because fear itself was seen as weakness that drained life. Courage conserved strength. When storms broke, Vikings gave thanks, not loudly, but with silence, offerings, or carved marks on the ship. Survival itself was prayer. This belief system didn't remove the cold, it removed panic. And in the frozen seas, that difference meant life. But belief alone could not save them forever. Eventually, the cold claimed every voyage, unless land appeared. Reaching land should have meant safety. But for Vikings, the first moments ashore were often the deadliest of the entire voyage. Cold didn't release its grip just because the ship stopped moving. After days at sea, their bodies were locked into survival mode. Muscles were tight, blood flow was restricted. Standing up too fast could cause collapse, or even death. Vikings knew this danger well. That's why they never rushed inland. Instead, they followed a deliberate ritual of controlled rewarming. They built fires immediately, not large bonfires, but low, steady flames. Sudden heat could shock the body, damaging muscles and organs. Warmth had to return gradually. Wet layers were not stripped away all at once. Outer furs came off first, while inner layers stayed on to prevent rapid heat loss. Everything was done in stages. Food came before rest. Fat and broth were consumed immediately to restart internal heat production. Only after eating did they allow themselves to truly relax. Only then did they sit or sleep. Some never made it that far. Men who survived the sea sometimes collapsed on land, their bodies finally surrendering once the danger seemed over. This is why Viking landings were slow, methodical, and quiet. They weren't cautious because of enemies, they were cautious because of the cold. The sea let go reluctantly. Only after bodies recovered did the warriors become raiders again. Until then, they were survivors first. Steel came second. And yet, even with all this knowledge, not every voyage ended in survival. The cold always took its share. The Vikings did not defeat the cold. They learned how to live inside it. This is the truth most people miss. Survival on the coldest seas wasn't about a single invention or miracle material. It was a system, layered, deliberate, and perfected through generations of loss. At the heart of that system was the forgotten trick: fat, worn, eaten, and burned slowly inside the body. While others trusted dry cloth and hope, Vikings trusted biology. They understood, long before science named it, that fat insulates, stores energy, and releases warmth over time. Fat-lined hides clung to the body, trapping heat even when soaked by saltwater. Bone marrow and rendered fat burned slowly inside their stomachs like hidden fires. Nothing was wasted, not food, not heat, not effort. But clothing alone didn't save them. The longship itself became part of the system, a floating shelter shaped by human bodies. Shields blocked wind, bodies packed together formed living insulation. Ember pots radiated controlled heat. Sleep became strategy, movement became medicine, belief became fuel when muscles failed. Every element supported the others. Remove one, and the system collapsed. This is why modern people misunderstand Viking endurance. They imagine brute strength and pain tolerance. In reality, it was discipline, knowledge, and respect for the cold. The cold was not an enemy to be conquered, it was a force to be negotiated with. And still, not all survived. The North always demanded payment. Every successful voyage was built on lessons written in frozen graves and silent seas. When Vikings finally reached land, the danger wasn't over. Rewarming too fast could kill. Resting too early could steal the strength they had left. Survival required patience even after the storm. And then, only then, did they become raiders again. Steel was raised, shields locked, axes remembered their weight. But none of that mattered without warmth. This forgotten trick, this layered mastery of fat, fire, movement, and mind is why Vikings reached places others couldn't. It's why they crossed seas that should have killed them. And it's why their legend was forged not just in battle, but in survival. The cold did not break them, it shaped them. And that is the real reason Vikings ruled the coldest seas on Earth.